Today, we're going to talk about one of the most complete industry extinctions in modern technology. Between 1988 and the mid-2000s, millions of Americans relied on small external boxes to see who was calling before they picked up the phone. These caller ID devices generated over $2 billion in revenue at their peak, employed thousands of workers, and sat on nightstands and kitchen counters across the nation. Then, in barely a decade, the entire industry simply vanished. Not because the technology failed, but because it succeeded so well that phone manufacturers decided to absorb the feature directly into their handsets. The caller ID industry began in 1988 when Bell Atlantic introduced the first commercial caller identification service in New Jersey. The technology itself had existed since the 1960s, originally developed for emergency services, but it took 2 decades for phone companies to figure out how to monetize it for residential customers. The service transmitted the calling party's phone number and sometimes their name between the first and second ring using a data protocol called frequency shift keying. Here's the crucial part though. Your regular telephone couldn't decode this data stream. You needed a separate device, and that created an entire industry overnight. The first standalone caller ID units hit the market in 1989, manufactured by companies like XL Communications and CID Electronics. These early devices looked like digital clocks with small LED displays and sold for around $300, which was serious money in 1989. You'd connect them between your phone jack and your telephone, and they'd intercept the data signal to show you incoming numbers. The value proposition was immediately obvious to consumers. No more interrupting dinner for telemarketers. No more wondering if that late-night call was an emergency or a wrong number. Sales exploded so fast that manufacturers couldn't keep up with demand through 1990 and 1991. By 1995, the caller ID box market had evolved into a sophisticated industry with dozens of major players. Companies like PhoneMate, Cidco, and Telezapper were manufacturing units with larger displays, memory storage for missed calls, and even voice announcement features. The boxes themselves had dropped to around $50 to $100, making them accessible to middle-class households nationwide. Retailers like Radio Shack, Best Buy, and Circuit City dedicated entire sections to caller ID devices, often displaying 20 or 30 different models side by side. The industry was generating over $400 million annually by this point, and phone companies were making additional billions from the monthly caller ID service fees. But while caller ID box manufacturers were celebrating their success, telephone manufacturers were watching very carefully. Companies like Panasonic, AT&T, and United realized they could eliminate the external box entirely by building the display and processing circuitry directly into their cordless phones. The first phones with integrated caller ID hit the market in 1995, and while they cost slightly more than regular cordless phones, they were significantly cheaper than buying a phone plus a separate caller ID device. More importantly, they saved counter space and eliminated the need for additional wiring and power adapters. The integration trend accelerated rapidly through the late 1990s. By 1998, you could buy a decent cordless phone with built-in caller ID for under $60. Major retailers began pushing these integrated phones aggressively because they offered higher profit margins than selling phones and caller ID boxes separately. The standalone caller ID manufacturers tried to respond by adding features like speakerphone capability, answering machine integration, and larger displays, but they were fighting a losing battle. Consumers overwhelmingly preferred the simplicity and cost savings of integrated phones. The numbers tell the story of this industry's rapid decline. In 1999, standalone caller ID devices still captured about 40% of the market, with integrated phones taking the remaining 60%. But by 2002, that ratio had flipped dramatically to just 15% standalone devices versus 85% integrated phones. Companies like Cidco tried to pivot by focusing on premium features and business customers, but the writing was on the wall. Circuit City stopped carrying standalone caller ID boxes in most locations by 2003. Radio Shack reduced their shelf space from an entire wall display to a single rack by 2004. The final blow came from an unexpected direction: the rise of cordless phone systems with multiple handsets. These systems, which became popular in the early 2000s, could display caller ID on every handset throughout the house. A family could have caller ID in the kitchen, bedroom, basement, and home office for less than the cost of a single standalone caller ID box just 5 years earlier. Companies like VTech and Panasonic were selling 4 handset systems with caller ID for under $150 by 2005. The value proposition of standalone boxes completely collapsed. By 2006, the standalone caller ID industry was essentially dead. The few remaining manufacturers had either gone out of business, been acquired by phone companies, or pivoted to completely different product lines. Stores that still carried caller ID boxes were selling them primarily as replacement units for elderly customers who refused to upgrade their phones. The irony is that caller ID technology itself was more popular than ever. Nearly every phone sold in America included the feature, and phone companies were collecting caller ID service fees from more customers than ever before. The technology had succeeded so completely that it eliminated its own hardware industry. The broader implications of this industry extinction extend far beyond just caller ID boxes. This was one of the first clear examples of how feature integration could completely eliminate entire product categories in the consumer electronics space. The same pattern would repeat over the following decade, with digital cameras being absorbed into smartphones, GPS devices being replaced by phone apps, and MP3 players disappearing into mobile devices. The caller ID box industry's death foreshadowed a fundamental shift in how consumers purchase technology, away from specialized single-function devices and toward integrated multifunction platforms. What makes this case particularly fascinating is how quickly and completely it happened. Unlike other industry transitions that took decades, the caller ID box market went from peak revenue to essentially zero in less than 8 years. There was no gradual decline, no period of coexistence between old and new technology. Once integrated phones reached a certain price point and feature set around 2000, the standalone device market simply collapsed. The last major retailer to carry caller ID boxes, Radio Shack, discontinued them entirely in 2008, marking the official end of a 20-year industry that had generated billions in revenue and served millions of customers. Today, finding a working caller ID box requires searching antique stores and estate sales, a fitting end for devices that were cutting-edge technology less than 2 decades ago.